Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the first session of the Ignite stage this morning. We have very few participants so far, so if you're interested in water, sanitation, hygiene in relation to disaster risk reduction, I'll be spending the next 15 minutes talking about some work that SEI, the Stockholm Environment Institute, has been working on over the last couple of years. So we call this the Wash and Rescue Project. It stands for Water, Sanitation and Hygiene in Resilient Cities and Urban Areas Adapting to Extreme Waters. So it links very strongly to a lot of the aims of the conference to link this strongly to disaster risk reduction and building resilience in urban areas. And I'm presenting this here on behalf of the team at SEI and the project leader, Åsa Johannesson, who can't be here today. This is a project which is funded by the Swedish Contingency Agency, or MSB. And it's also work in progress. So what I'd like to do is talk through sort of some of our thinking on this topic so far. So as you can imagine, and those of you who work in this area know only too well, a wash system is more than toilets and pipes. It's a very complex, integrated system that has to fulfill a lot of functions. So in terms of sanitation, promoting hygiene, delivering clean water, transporting excreta and other waste away from the source, and also in terms of disease management. So in that sense, it's a very complex system which links people with technology and also with the environment. So it's a complex system, and so what we're trying to understand is how we can make these systems less vulnerable to different kinds of hazards, particularly climate and weather-related hazards that occur fairly frequently in some places, particularly floods and drought events. And then how to find ways of making these systems more resilient. So, of course, as our world is urbanizing and a lot of the population growth is occurring in unplanned or actually quite poorly planned settlements, this is a risk for many urban and peri-urban inhabitants, and it's a risk that has been growing quite significantly over the last few decades. And despite all the good efforts that have been made, for example, under the Millennium Development Goals, to improve wash systems, it is still one of the aims or one of the goals of the MDGs that really hasn't progressed as much as one would have hoped. And there's still a lot of systems out there that are not very well designed from the start, or they're not very well implemented or maintained. Some people even go as far as calling it a disaster in itself, in terms of the state of the wash systems and the negative effects on human development. So, of course, we can imagine that if a wash system is not functioning properly, if people are exposed to diseases, for example, it has significant implications for people's health, well-being, and ultimately for their livelihoods and the economy. And because of that, it is also a crucial factor in determining social vulnerability to a range of different hazards. Particularly in an event, if there is a flood or a drought situation, particularly when these events happen quite frequently, or if they're quite severe, or maybe they happen quite frequently, you can imagine how people would find it very difficult to cope with that situation. It might take a long time to build back the infrastructure and enable people to get back to work if they become sick after a disaster. And the context for this work is really that we have seen a significant increase in the number of disasters. Disaster risks are increasing globally and particularly in certain parts of the world, and I'll go a little bit more into detail there. And we're still trying to understand the drivers of these increasing risks. We've got a much better understanding today than we had, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And we now understand that the drivers of risk are really quite complex, and that it's a combination of environmental hazards, also climate change, but also environmental degradation, as well as poorly planned development, insecure livelihoods, conflict, and so on. So it paints a very complicated picture. And another thing that we have come to realize, I think, in the 10 years of the HFA is that we're creating a lot of new risks, and that a lot of risks are also, that these are growing faster than maybe we are able to reduce existing risks. And climate change is clearly one of the drivers of increasing risks because of the expected increase in frequency, severity, and also spatial extent and duration of such events. So just to show you a few statistics, and these might look familiar, they're from the special report of the IPCC published in 2012 on managing extreme risks for disaster risk through disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And you can see here, these are all the climate and weather related disasters, as well as hydrological disasters, so water-related disasters. This is simply the number of events between 2000 and 2008. And you can see here, of course, particularly Asia has had a large number of events, and also in terms of the impacts here in monetary terms, over $22 billion worth. But when you then look at different kinds of hazards and the number of people that are exposed to these hazards, you can see in particular that we have a huge number of people exposed in Asia as well as in Africa. And what I want to point out particularly is the growth in the number of people exposed. And this is, again, from the SREX report. And this is the black circle shows the number of people exposed this is in thousands, so this is 29 million. And this was in 1970, and this going up to almost 78 million so this is, I think, 2030. And this is assuming that the size of the hazards, the intensity of the hazards actually stays the same. And we know that that hazard, particularly weather and climate-related hazards, are actually increasing. So this is a very conservative estimate of the increasing risk. So this one is for floods, and then there's another one for tropical cyclones. Again, you can see here the huge number of people exposed, particularly in the Asian region, and how that is expected to grow over the next few decades, and again, then how that compares to some of the other world regions. So you can see that, of course, particularly in the Asia region and also parts of Africa in particular, we have a huge challenge in terms of the number of people that are already exposed to weather and climate-related hazards and that are likely to be exposed in the future. So what does this mean for WASH systems? So water and sanitation systems can be overwhelmed already by fairly small-scale events. For example, if you have a flash flood, as has occurred here in an urban area, in this case in Maputo. And so these sorts of events happen in more and more cities, and they happen more and more frequently, and we know this from Asia as well. And it really shows the importance of looking to urban planning as a really important tool to reduce the risk of these flash flood events from happening. And this could be either very small scale, affecting smaller parts of the city, or could actually extend to quite large areas in cities. And then here's another example. This is from Cebu city in the Philippines. And here we can see a sort of longer term process and a much more large scale process where we're looking here at the groundwater salinization and pollution. And you can see that sort of over time, the level of salinization has increased quite significantly. So a lot of people that used to be able to draw their clean drinking water from the groundwater wells are no longer able to do this. And this is a process that is likely to continue over time unless some sort of intervention is going to happen to which looks at the broader processes of that. And then it is particularly poor urban dwellers that are particularly at risk from these sorts of events because quite often, and especially in informal settlements, of course, there is not the infrastructure there to basically make sure that people can recover quickly. So what we're trying to do with this project is to take a resilience perspective to see how resilience thinking might be useful in terms of building better wash systems. And I won't take too much time explaining this diagram, but just to point out that, again, because we have such a complex system with the wash, we really need to look at the different sectors that are involved here, and particularly linking the wash system with wider urban development, but also at the catchment level with the wider sort of water resource management that occurs, for example, in the river system or in the delta or wherever the wash system is located. And it brings in a lot of legal and institutional aspects and different kinds of stakeholders that need to engage in this process. And so we're looking at a series of case studies across the world to try and understand these processes. So we're working with local municipal stakeholders and researchers and also NGOs to get to grips with these. And we're doing this through a collaborative learning process where we try to jointly really understand the problem, what are the risks to the system, to design a learning process that engages the stakeholders and to try and identify some good practice lessons learned from that. And so what we're doing is we're applying the resilience practice handbook, which was published by the Resilience Alliance. And I don't have time to go through all these resilience ideas here, but basically there are these sort of 10 key ideas or principles of resilience thinking here, which we need to consider when we think about building more resilient wash systems. And so basically what we're doing is we're talking through each of these ideas with wash practitioners and with urban planners to see how you would actually translate some of these ideas into some sort of operational context. Because a lot of these ideas seem quite academic, they seem quite conceptual, theoretical, and I think there's been, of course, a lot of work recently to try and understand how you can operationalize resilience, and a lot of people are working on that. And there's been a lot of really good work also through sort of city-level networks, learning networks, like the Climate Resilient City Network, for example, and many others. So that's an important component. And so the outcome of this will be an interactive decision support tool that will be particularly targeted to wash practitioners to help them navigate through that complex wash system and the kinds of things they need to think about when they design or maybe want to make changes to the system. And I'll finish there, and I'll just thank the rest of the project team here across the SEI, but also Lund University, Resilient Wash, and the Durban University of Technology. And all of this has been part of a new SEI global initiative on transforming development and disaster risk reduction. And I'll just put up the vision there to leave. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time now for questions. So I think I'll hand over straight to the other speaker. Thank you very much.